Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode considers this question: does DNA research make archaeology obsolete? My straight answer to this question is a simple no. In fact, archaeology persists as the only field of study that can obtain objective material evidence directly from the past, and it has not yet been made obsolete by DNA studies or any other discipline. So far, DNA studies of modern-day human populations have shown potential to make inferences about the past, but those inferences always meet logical limitations. In rare cases, genuinely ancient DNA samples have been obtained through archaeological research, and those results repeatedly have exposed problems in the orthodox interpretations of the worldwide DNA databases. I should acknowledge that I personally have worked productively with the researchers who examine ancient DNA from archaeological sites, and I am aware of other successful partnerships. Nonetheless, I have seen increasingly more and more examples every year of DNA studies that are incompatible with the reality of the archaeological record. Moreover, whenever DNA studies about the ancient past are published, then routinely they are overturned, perhaps just a few weeks later, and the resulting literature has been incoherent. The most recent popular book-length treatment of ancient DNA studies inadvertently revealed the inconsistencies and unreliability of these studies, and instead, it demonstrated that archaeology is by far superior in its technique, method, and theory when studying the past. Regardless of my opinions, something about DNA studies, and especially about ancient DNA research, has captured the world of popular science, and by default, this fascination has created a bias in favor of DNA studies against archaeology. Most, but not all, of the published ancient DNA studies are ignorant of archaeology, or at best, incompatible with archaeology. Meanwhile, archaeology overall has become less successful in the highly competitive world of scientific publishing, largely because of the favoritism given to DNA research that by default disallows opportunities for other publications. The obvious solution here is for DNA research to work more productively with archaeology. As I have noted, I personally have been involved in exactly these kinds of positive teamwork projects, and a few of my colleagues can refer to other successful examples. Unfortunately, the scientific publishing scene has shown signs of ignoring archaeology and instead promoting DNA studies that are fundamentally incompatible with the reality of the material archaeological record. In my view, archaeology and DNA research tend to be incompatible, although in principle they could cooperate productively. The major aspect of incompatibility involves the role of chronology. Archaeology fundamentally works with primary data sets from the past in their own demonstrable chronological order. In contrast, DNA studies rely to some extent on interpreting the past from the perspective of present-day population patterns in DNA lineages. In archaeology, the material facts of sites, artifacts, and middens are obtained directly from their ancient contexts that can be measured objectively in their specific geographic locations and time periods. In this way, archaeology can produce a factual outline of what happened in the past, where those activities occurred, and when they happened. In DNA studies, most research is based on collecting samples from modern-day living people. Certain distinctions within the modern-day DNA must have occurred as mutations at some point in time in the past, and then those mutations were inherited through multiple generations. These kinds of multi-generational mutations, in principle, could be situated in a timeline of a molecular clock of human DNA mutations, but they would need to be attached with some manner of dating, perhaps borrowing from archaeology. So far, though, no single molecular clock has been proven to be accurate into the distant past, and competing hypotheses have been proposed without sufficient testing against baseline data from the past. Increasingly over the last few years, DNA studies have been applied to ancient human remains from archaeological sites, and those results have been most compatible with archaeology. As you might imagine, though, the key problem here is that only some, but certainly not all archaeological sites contain human remains, and even those sites with ancient bones and teeth may not have retained sufficiently preserved DNA for analysis. In reality, the worldwide database of truly ancient DNA is small and incomplete when compared with the thorough modern-day DNA profiles of the world's diverse populations. Even when working with genuinely ancient DNA samples borrowed from archaeology, the interpretive theory and methodology relies on comparing the ancient DNA profile against the modern-day DNA patterns. The DNA patterns of the modern world have been documented extensively, but the worldwide DNA patterns of ancient time periods are by comparison sparsely known. In fact, many of the ancient time periods are completely blank in terms of DNA records, and others have been known only through limited examples in a few regions. In archaeology, the worldwide records of ancient sites and artifacts can be plotted for every time period in chronological order. By comparison, the ancient DNA records have been frustratingly sparse and vague. Whenever I see a publication of an ancient DNA study, then I evaluate the conclusions with reference to the number of individual samples in the study. How many samples were examined, and were they sufficient for representing larger populations? Another consideration involves the time period of each sample. Was the time period estimated according to assumptions about modern-day DNA sampling, or was it measured in a real archaeological site context? I would want to know how many DNA samples were obtained from each measured geographic area and time period. If those results could be plotted on their own terms and in their own chronological order, then what would they reveal? So far, the genuinely ancient DNA samples have not been sufficient to depict a DNA map of the world in a series of time intervals that you would expect of archaeological sites and artifacts. Instead, the picture has been incomplete and vague for most time periods, in contrast with an extensively documented modern period. Archaeological sites offer an advantage of situating specific objective evidence within constrained geographic areas and time periods. Ideally, DNA studies can be added into this contextual framing, but this ideal goal will need to wait for considerably more research at a worldwide scale. For those rare cases of ancient DNA samples from archaeological sites, the results so far have been informative, yet they could be questioned in terms of how well they may or may not represent larger populations. As I already have mentioned, the few known ancient DNA findings generally have been compared against the much more extensively known DNA profiles of modern populations, and logically this obvious anachronism has caused serious problems. In order to avoid the fallacy of comparing ancient DNA profiles with modern DNA patterns, the research projects and procedures would need to be reshaped in their technique, method, and theory to be compatible with the real parameters of the archaeological record. From the standpoint of archaeology, DNA studies need to demonstrate how the geographic areas were defined, how the time periods were measured, how the sampling strategy was performed, and of course, how the DNA findings related with the archaeological evidence. Without this basic control over the DNA findings, the results essentially become useless in the perspective of archaeology, as proven by the repeated corrections and contradictory conclusions in the published literature of ancient DNA studies. What are your thoughts about ancient DNA research and archaeology? What would you like to see in future studies? I did not present too much detail here, but hopefully the information has been enough for you to pursue the issues more on your own. Please remember to subscribe to this channel, share with your friends, and see new videos every month with the Archaeology Studio.